the ancient tribe that defended their land from Viking invasion. Picture this: a group of Viking warriors, men who've raided monasteries in England and struck fear into the hearts of European kings, stand at the edge of a frozen forest in northern Scandinavia. They're not advancing, they're not even talking, they're just listening, waiting. Because somewhere in those woods, they know they're being watched by people. Their own sagas describe with a word that roughly translates to terrible magic. These Vikings, who believed in Odin and Thor, who carried hammers blessed by their gods, were absolutely terrified of entering this land. And here's the thing that should make you stop and think. These weren't superstitious fools. They were right to be afraid. In the winter of 1026, an entire Viking expedition vanished in the lands of the people they called the Finns, what we now know as the Sami, not defeated in glorious battle, not shipwrecked. They just disappeared. 60 armed men, experienced in Arctic survival, gone without a single body ever being found. The only trace: their abandoned camp with food still in the pots, weapons laid carefully aside, and strange symbols carved into the snow around the perimeter. Symbols that no Viking could read, but every Viking who saw them understood meant one thing: go back, or join them in whatever fate they met. But before I tell you what really happened to those men, and why the Sami people became the only group in Scandinavia to never truly fall under Viking control, you need to understand something. Everything you think you know about Vikings being unstoppable conquerors is about to be turned upside down. Because what I'm about to share with you isn't just another Viking story. It's the story the Vikings themselves tried to forget. The discovery of that abandoned camp sent shockwaves through Viking society that lasted for generations. The search party that found it was led by Thorvald the Bold, a man who had personally fought in 3 raids on English monasteries and who wore scars from Frankish swords like badges of honour. This was someone who had stood in shield walls while arrows rained down, who had charged into burning villages without hesitation, who had sailed into unknown waters where sea monsters were said to dwell. But when Thorvald saw those symbols in the snow, witnesses say he went pale and immediately ordered his men to retreat. Not investigate, not search for survivors, retreat. The symbols themselves defied explanation. They weren't runes, the writing system Vikings knew and used. They were pictographic, showing simplified images that seemed to shift meaning the longer you looked at them. There were reindeer, clearly drawn. There were human figures. But there were also things that appeared to be halfway between both, creatures that had no place in Viking understanding of the world. The snow around these symbols hadn't been disturbed by footprints or tools. It was as if the symbols had appeared spontaneously, carved by invisible hands. Even stranger were the tracks surrounding the camp. They showed people walking normally for several paces, then the footprints would simply stop, not fade away gradually, as if covered by fresh snow, but stop abruptly, as if the walkers had been lifted into the air. Then, impossibly, the same tracks would resume 20 or 30 feet away, sometimes in directions that made no sense, sometimes overlapping in ways that suggested people had occupied the same space at the same time. Thorvald's men were experienced trackers who could read a story in disturbed snow, but this story was written in a language they didn't understand. The abandoned equipment told its own disturbing tale. The weapons hadn't been taken as trophies, which would have made sense if the camp had been overrun. They had been arranged. Swords were laid out in patterns that almost seemed meaningful. Shields were propped against trees in formations that looked defensive, but protected nothing. Helmets sat on stakes driven into the ground, facing outward like blind sentinels. It was as if the Vikings had been made to create these arrangements, but for purposes that made no tactical sense. The food still in the cooking pots was perhaps the most unsettling detail. It hadn't frozen solid, suggesting it had been abandoned recently, perhaps only hours before the search party arrived. But there were no signs of struggle, no blood on the snow, no indication of panic. The Vikings had simply stopped in the middle of their meal and walked away. Or been taken away. The difference mattered, but no one could tell which had happened. When word of this reached the Norwegian court, it should have triggered a massive response. 60 warriors don't just disappear. In Viking society, such a loss demanded vengeance, required a blood price to be paid. But instead, something unprecedented happened. The king consulted with his most experienced raiders, men who had carved their names into history with sword and axe, and they advised him to do nothing, to let the lost men remain lost, to forbid any rescue or revenge expedition. These weren't cowards giving this advice. These were men like Eric Bloodaxe's surviving warriors, who had fought from York to Constantinople, men who had faced Greek fire, Saxon shield walls, and Frankish cavalry charges. Men who believed that dying in battle guaranteed entry to Valhalla, who should have been eager for the glory of avenging their fallen comrades. But when it came to the Sami territories, these fearless warriors counselled fear. Now, you have to understand what this means in Viking culture. Refusing to avenge fallen warriors wasn't just unusual, it was shameful. It suggested weakness, invited ridicule, and could undermine a king's authority. But the fear of what lay in those northern forests was stronger than the fear of shame. The lost expedition became something Vikings didn't talk about openly, a shared knowledge that existed in whispers and warnings, but never in the boastful tales told in mead halls. And this wasn't an isolated incident. This was part of a pattern that had been building for centuries, a growing collection of stories that Vikings tried not to tell but couldn't quite forget. Stories that suggested the Sami weren't just another tribe to be conquered, but something altogether different, something that operated by rules Vikings didn't understand and couldn't counter. Let me tell you about another incident, one that happened decades before but set the tone for Viking-Sami relations. It comes from the saga of King Harald Fairhair, the first king to unite Norway, a man whose power was unprecedented in Scandinavian history. Harald had sons, many sons, and he sent them to govern different regions of his kingdom. One of these sons was Rongvald, described in the sagas as brave, intelligent, and skilled in both warfare and governance. The perfect Viking prince, Rongvald was given control of a territory that bordered Sami lands. He decided to expand his domain northward, to claim the rich hunting grounds and trade routes the Sami controlled. He prepared carefully, gathering intelligence, recruiting experienced warriors, planning his campaign with the thoroughness that had made his father successful. But Rongvald never got the chance to launch his invasion. He was found dead in his locked chamber on the morning he was supposed to march north. The door was still barred from the inside. The windows were too small for a person to fit through. There were no wounds on his body, no signs of poison, no indication of illness. But Rongvald was dead, and his appearance had changed in death, in ways that defied explanation. His hair, which had been dark brown the night before, had turned completely white, not grey, as might happen with age, but white as fresh snow. His eyes, which should have clouded in death, remained clear, but had changed colour, taking on the pale blue of deep ice. His expression was one of absolute terror, the kind of fear that Vikings were supposed to be incapable of feeling. And on his chest, placed with deliberate care, was a small drum no bigger than a hand. The drum was covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly, not physically painful, but mentally disturbing in a way that made strong men turn away. The few who forced themselves to study it reported seeing different things. Some saw battles that hadn't happened yet, others saw their own deaths. Still others claimed the symbols moved when they weren't looking directly at them. The drum was eventually burned on the orders of Harald himself, but those who witnessed the burning swore they heard screaming in the flames, though the sound didn't come from any human throat. The saga attributes Rongvald's death to Gander, harmful magic sent by the Sami. But here's what the saga doesn't tell you, what was passed down in whispers rather than written words. 3 days before his death, Rongvald had received a delegation of Sami representatives. They had come to negotiate, to establish boundaries, to prevent the conflict Rongvald was planning. He had dismissed them with contempt, threatening to hang them if they didn't leave immediately. They left, but one of them, an old woman whose eyes were milky with cataracts, turned back at the door and spoke a single sentence in perfect Old Norse. 3 nights remain to you. Rongvald laughed at the threat. He doubled his guards, had his food tasted for poison, even had his chamber searched for hidden passages or weapons. He took every precaution a warrior could take against physical attack, but he was preparing for the wrong kind of war. On the 3rd night, Despite guards at his door and warriors sleeping in the adjacent rooms, something entered his locked chamber and left only death and that drum as calling cards. This is where Viking encounters with the Sami take a different turn from their conflicts with other peoples. When Vikings fought the English or the Franks, they understood the rules. Armies met, battles were fought, territories were won or lost. Even when they encountered unfamiliar tactics or weapons, the fundamental nature of warfare remained comprehensible. But with the Sami, Vikings found themselves in conflicts where the very nature of reality seemed negotiable. The sagas are full of these encounters, though they're often buried in language that makes them easy to dismiss as superstition. But when you read them carefully, when you notice the patterns, a different picture emerges. Viking warriors didn't just fear Sami magic, they feared something much more concrete, their complete inability to understand or predict Sami capabilities. Take the account from the Orkneyinga saga about a group of Vikings who pursued Sami raiders back into their territory. The raiders had taken cattle and goods from a Norwegian settlement, a clear provocation that demanded response. 30 Vikings set out in pursuit, following clear tracks in the snow. The trail was easy to follow at first. Too easy, some of them thought. But their leader pushed them on. As they moved deeper into Sami territory, strange things began to happen. The tracks they were following would suddenly multiply, showing 10 times as many people as they were pursuing. Then the tracks would converge again, returning to the original number. The Vikings found themselves walking through areas where the temperature would change dramatically within a few steps, from mild to bone-chilling cold and back again. They heard voices calling their names from the forest, not in Sami language, but in perfect Old Norse, sometimes in the voices of family members who were hundreds of miles away. On the second night, the Vikings made camp in what seemed like a good defensive position, a clearing with clear sight lines in all directions. They set watches, kept their weapons close, stayed alert for attack, but no attack came. Instead, when morning arrived, they discovered that every piece of metal they carried had been altered. Not damaged or stolen, but changed. Their sword blades were soft as lead. Their axe heads crumbled when touched. Their shields' metal bosses had turned brittle as ice. Every piece of iron and steel had been transformed into something useless. The Vikings had no choice but to retreat, but even that became a nightmare. The path they had followed into the forest was gone. Not covered by snow, but gone, as if it had never existed. Trees stood where they clearly remembered open ground. Solid earth existed where there had been frozen streams. They wandered for days, growing weaker, more confused, more frightened with each passing hour. Men began to disappear whenever they stepped out of sight of the group, even for moments. No sounds of struggle, no calls for help, just gone. Finally, when only half the original group remained, they found their way back to Norwegian territory. But they were changed. Some couldn't stop shaking, even when sitting next to roaring fires. Others would wake screaming from nightmares they couldn't remember. Several insisted they could still hear their names being called from the forest, even though they were miles from any trees. Within a year, most were dead from accidents, illness, or their own hands. The few survivors refused to speak about what had happened, except to warn others never to pursue Sami into their own lands. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern that Vikings recognized but couldn't understand or counter. Every attempt to use conventional Viking tactics against the Sami resulted not just in failure, but in experiences that challenged Viking understanding of how the world worked. And this is crucial to understand. Vikings weren't primitive peoples frightened by things they didn't understand. They were sophisticated warriors who had encountered diverse cultures, technologies, and fighting styles across half the known world. But the Sami represented something outside their frame of reference. Now we come to something that reveals just how deep Viking fear of the Sami ran: the tribute expeditions. You might think that collecting tribute would be a simple matter of force and intimidation. After all, Vikings successfully extracted wealth from kingdoms across Europe. But when it came to the Sami, even collecting tribute became an exercise in terror. Let me paint you a picture of what these expeditions were like. The Vikings wouldn't simply sail north and demand payment. They would send messages months in advance, negotiating meeting places and times. These meetings always happened at specific locations on the border between Norse and Sami territory, never deeper in either direction. The Vikings would arrive in force, sometimes with 100 warriors, for what should have been a simple tax collection from nomadic herders. They came prepared for battle against an enemy they desperately hoped not to fight. The Sami would appear exactly when agreed, neither early nor late, as if they had ways of measuring time that didn't depend on sun or stars. They would bring the tribute, furs of incredible quality, walrus ivory, bird feathers for arrow fletching, sometimes living hawks trained for hunting. The exchange would be made with minimal communication, the Vikings eager to complete the transaction and leave. But here's what the official records don't mention, what you have to piece together from personal accounts and archaeological evidence. These tribute expeditions had a mortality rate higher than many Viking raids. Not from battle, but from what the Vikings called the northern sickness. Men would fall ill with symptoms that didn't match any known disease. They would develop fears of specific objects or sounds for no reason. Some would lose the ability to speak their native language, instead babbling in tongues no one recognized. Others would be found dead in their tents, with no marks on their bodies, their faces twisted in expressions of such terror that their comrades would bury them face down to avoid looking at them. Hakon Grotgardsson, a Norwegian jarl who led several tribute expeditions, left a detailed account that survives in fragments. He describes camping just outside Sami territory while waiting for the appointed meeting time. On the first night, every flame in the Viking camp turned blue without warning. Not gradually, but instantly, as if responding to some unheard command. The blue flames gave no heat, though they still consumed wood. Men huddled together for warmth, afraid to venture beyond the strange light. On the second night, the Vikings heard drums, not the chaotic drumming of war, but precise, mathematical rhythms that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in their bones. The drumming came from all directions, sometimes near, sometimes far, but always maintaining perfect synchronization, despite the distances involved. Several men claimed they could feel their heartbeats trying to match the rhythm, and fought to maintain their own natural pulse. On the third night, the night before the tribute meeting, something visited the camp. Hakon is careful to say something rather than someone. It moved between the tents, visible only as a distortion in the air, like heat shimmer on a cold night. It touched certain men, and those it touched were changed. They could suddenly understand the speech of birds. They knew things about their comrades that had never been spoken aloud. They could predict weather changes hours in advance. But they also aged visibly, gaining years in minutes. By morning, 3 of the touched men had died of what appeared to be extreme old age, though they had been young warriors the day before. The tribute meeting itself proceeded without incident, but Hakon notes something significant. The Sami representatives showed no surprise at the reduced number of Vikings, as if they knew exactly what had happened in the camp. They provided extra furs, which they indicated were for those who had been touched but survived. They knew, they had known all along. The entire display had been a message: we could do worse if we chose to. This dynamic, where Vikings were made to feel powerless in ways they couldn't understand or counter, shaped every interaction between the two peoples. It wasn't just fear of death that affected the Vikings. They were, after all, a culture that glorified dying in battle. It was fear of the unknown, of forces that operated outside their understanding of how the world worked. The Sami had turned the Vikings' own beliefs into weapons against them. But this raises an important question that historians have long debated. Were the Sami actually using magic, or was something else happening? To answer that, we need to understand the concept of spiritual warfare as Vikings understood it, and how the Sami exploited these beliefs with a sophistication that wouldn't be seen again until the development of modern psychological operations. The Vikings lived in a world where the spiritual and physical were not separate realms but intertwined realities. They believed in seidr, a form of magic practiced primarily by women that could influence fate, weather, and minds. They believed in golda, the power of spoken words and songs to alter reality. They believed in Ganda, harmful spirits that could be sent to attack enemies. These weren't abstract religious concepts, but practical realities that influenced daily decisions. The Sami understood these beliefs intimately. Through centuries of contact, trade, and occasional intermarriage, they had learned not just what Vikings believed, but how those beliefs shaped Viking behavior. And they weaponized this knowledge with remarkable effectiveness. When Vikings heard drums in the night, they heard what their worldview told them to hear: magical attacks that could steal their souls. When they saw impossible tracks in the snow, they saw evidence of shape-shifting enemies. When their comrades fell ill with strange symptoms, they saw the effects of curses rather than unfamiliar diseases or environmental factors. This psychological framework meant that Sami didn't need actual magic to be terrifyingly effective. They just needed Vikings to believe in their magic. Every unexplained event, every coincidence, every natural phenomenon that Vikings didn't understand became evidence of Sami power. The Sami cultivated this fear deliberately, creating theatrical displays designed to reinforce Viking beliefs about their supernatural abilities. But here's where it gets even more interesting. The Vikings didn't just fear Sami magic, they sought to counter it with their own spiritual weapons, leading to what can only be described as a supernatural arms race. And this competition reveals something remarkable about both cultures and how they understood power. The Vikings began bringing their own Seether practitioners on expeditions into Sami territory. These were women, and occasionally men, who claimed the ability to see and influence the invisible world. They would perform elaborate rituals before expeditions, seeking to protect Vikings from Sami magic. They would create bind runes, complex magical symbols that were supposed to ward off curses. They would conduct ceremonies to appease local spirits and convince them not to aid the Sami. The results were mixed at best. Sometimes these precautions seemed to work, and expeditions would proceed without major incident. But just as often, the presence of Viking magic users seemed to provoke even more disturbing responses from the Sami. There are accounts of Viking Seether practitioners going mad during expeditions, claiming they were engaged in spiritual battles they were losing badly. Some would begin speaking in the same strange tongues as those affected by the northern sickness. Others would perform their own rituals incorrectly, as if their knowledge had been scrambled or inverted. One particularly disturbing account comes from the Landnámabók, which describes a Viking Volva, a female seer and magic practitioner, who accompanied an expedition to establish trade relations with the Sami. She was powerful enough to have earned the nickname Storm Rider for her alleged ability to control weather. But when the expedition entered Sami territory, she began to deteriorate. She claimed she could no longer see the future, that her visions showed only darkness and drums. She would wake screaming about being hunted by creatures that were not bears but wore bear shapes, not men but walked as men. On the fifth night in Sami territory, she performed a ritual that was supposed to protect the expedition from harm, but something went wrong. Witnesses described her voice changing, becoming multiple voices speaking in harmony. She prophesied not in Old Norse, but in a language that hurt to hear, full of sounds human throats shouldn't be able to make. When she finally collapsed, she had aged decades in minutes. She lived 3 more days, during which she begged constantly to be taken south, away from the drums that never stop. The failure of Viking spiritual defences against Sami practices created a crisis of confidence that went beyond military concerns. If Viking gods and magic couldn't protect them, what did that say about Viking beliefs? Some began to suggest that the Sami served older, more powerful gods. Others theorized that the land itself was allied with the Sami, that the very earth and sky of the north would always side with its original inhabitants against invaders. This spiritual uncertainty had practical consequences. Viking expeditions into Sami territory began to require not just military preparation, but extensive religious ceremonies. Offerings to the gods increased dramatically. Warriors would undergo purification rituals before heading north. Some would have protective runes tattooed on their bodies, painful processes that were believed to offer magical protection. The fact that these protections often failed only increased the anxiety. The Vikings even began adopting certain Sami practices, though they would never admit it openly. Archaeological evidence shows Viking settlements near Sami territories containing drums similar to those used by Sami Noadi. Viking graves from these regions sometimes include bear teeth and bird skulls arranged in patterns that match Sami spiritual symbolism. Some Vikings apparently concluded that if they couldn't defeat Sami magic, they might at least try to appropriate it. But this appropriation came with its own dangers. Vikings who spent too much time in Sami territory, or who became too interested in Sami practices, were viewed with suspicion by their own people. They were said to be turned, to have had their minds influenced by Sami magic. Some were accused of serving two masters, of being Viking in body but Sami in spirit. These suspicions could lead to exile, or worse, creating yet another way that proximity to the Sami could destroy a Viking's life. The psychological impact of this spiritual warfare extended far beyond those who actually encountered the Sami. Stories spread throughout Viking society, growing more frightening with each telling. Parents would threaten misbehaving children with being sent north to the Sami. Warriors would boast about battles they had fought across the known world, but fall silent when asked if they had ever ventured into the far north. The Sami became not just enemies, but bogeymen, figures of fear that haunted Viking imagination. As we transition from these accounts of fear and failed spiritual warfare, a pattern becomes clear. The Vikings, masters of conventional warfare, conquerors of kingdoms, found themselves completely outmatched by an enemy that refused to fight on Viking terms. But what exactly were the Sami doing? How did a people without standing armies, without fortified cities, without even written laws, manage to terrify the most feared warriors of their age? The answer lies not in magic, though the Vikings certainly believed magic was involved. It lies in something far more sophisticated, a comprehensive understanding of psychological warfare, environmental tactics, and asymmetric conflict that wouldn't be formally theorized by military scientists for another 1,000 years. The Sami had developed ways of fighting that attacked not Viking bodies, but Viking minds, not Viking armies, but Viking will to fight. What you're about to learn next will completely change how you think about Vikings, about indigenous resistance, and about the nature of power itself. Because the Sami weren't just defending themselves, they were conducting a masterclass in unconventional warfare that made conventional Viking strength not just useless, but a liability. And the Vikings knew it, even if they couldn't articulate it in terms other than magic and curses. Now here's where everything changes. The Vikings were right to be afraid, but not for the reasons they thought. The Sami weren't wielding dark magic or commanding supernatural forces. They were doing something far more impressive. They had built a civilization so perfectly adapted to one of Earth's most hostile environments that their very existence seemed impossible to outsiders. And they had weaponized that adaptation in ways that Vikings, for all their military sophistication, simply couldn't comprehend or counter. To understand how the Sami terrified the Vikings, you first need to understand who the Sami really were. Not the primitive nomads that later historians would portray them as, but a people whose complexity would make Viking society look simple by comparison. Because while Vikings measured time in 4 seasons, the Sami had discovered something that would take Western science another millennium to understand. The Arctic doesn't follow the same rules as the rest of the world. The Sami calendar divided the year into 8 distinct seasons, each with its own survival requirements, its own opportunities, and most importantly, its own tactical advantages. This wasn't just a different way of counting time, it was a completely different way of understanding reality. Where Vikings saw winter, the Sami saw 3 separate seasons, each as different from the others as summer is from winter in southern lands. There was Gidardalv, the early spring that Vikings didn't even recognize as separate from winter. During this season, the snow developed a crust that could support a man's weight in the morning, but would collapse by afternoon. The Sami knew exactly when this transition would occur, down to the hour, based on temperature patterns, sun angle, and subtle changes in snow crystal structure that Vikings couldn't even perceive. They would lead Viking pursuers onto seemingly solid snow, timing their movements so that they crossed just before the crust weakened, while Vikings following behind would break through, exhausting themselves and becoming easy targets. Then came Gidarjes, the late spring when ice that looked solid became a death trap. The Sami could read the color variations in ice that indicated thickness, spot the barely visible cracks that preceded a break, hear the subtle sounds that meant a frozen river was about to become a torrent. Vikings, even those experienced with Norwegian winters, couldn't distinguish between ice that would hold and ice that would kill. The Sami would cross frozen water at specific points, even marking safe passages with signs that looked decorative to Vikings, but were actually precise instructions for where and when to cross. The summer seasons, which Vikings thought they understood, held their own mysteries. There was Gies, the true summer when the sun never set. Vikings found this disorienting, losing track of time, unable to maintain normal sleep patterns. But the Sami had adapted over millennia to function perfectly in constant daylight. They knew how to use the eternal sun to exhaust enemies, forcing them to remain alert during what their bodies insisted should be night, wearing them down psychologically before any physical confrontation occurred. But perhaps the most weaponizable season was Tjak-Jagizi, the autumn-summer, when fog banks could roll in within minutes and reduce visibility to arm's length. The Sami had developed navigation techniques that didn't rely on sight. They could move through fog using sound, smell, and an intimate knowledge of terrain that bordered on supernatural. Vikings would find themselves surrounded by fog, hearing Sami voices from all directions, unable to determine distance or location, while Sami hunters moved through the mist like it wasn't there. Each of these seasons came with its own hunting strategies, its own foods, its own dangers, and its own ways of warfare. The Sami knew which plants produced useful compounds in which seasons, when certain animals would behave in predictable ways, how weather patterns would shift not just day by day, but hour by hour. This wasn't knowledge that could be learned quickly. It was encoded in thousands of years of survival, passed down through generations in songs and stories that Vikings dismissed as primitive folklore. The sophistication of this temporal understanding becomes even clearer when you realize that the Sami didn't just adapt to these seasons. They had learned to predict them with accuracy that modern meteorology struggles to match. They could tell you, weeks in advance, when the first fog of Tjak-Jagizi would arrive. They knew when specific valleys would experience temperature inversions that could trap cold air and create localized blizzards. They understood atmospheric patterns that wouldn't be formally described by science for centuries. This predictive ability gave them an overwhelming tactical advantage. While Vikings reacted to weather, the Sami anticipated it. They would begin positioning themselves days before a storm, knowing exactly where Vikings would seek shelter, where the wind would be strongest, where snow would drift to create natural barriers. By the time weather arrived, the Sami had already won whatever engagement they were planning. The Vikings were playing checkers, while the Sami were playing chess, thinking moves ahead in a game where the board itself kept changing. But temporal mastery was just one aspect of Sami sophistication. Their relationship with the Arctic landscape went beyond mere survival. They had achieved something that should have been impossible. They had made one of Earth's most hostile environments into an ally, a partner in their resistance against invaders. Consider the simple act of movement across Arctic terrain. Vikings, even those from northern Norway, moved through the landscape. They pushed against it, fought it, tried to overcome it. Every step was a battle against snow, ice, and cold. Full-grown Viking warriors, strong men who could march for days in southern lands, would be exhausted after a few hours of breaking through snow crust, sinking knee-deep with every step, burning precious calories just to move forward. The Sami didn't fight the landscape. They flowed with it. Their skis weren't just transportation tools. They were precision instruments crafted for specific snow conditions. They had different ski designs for fresh powder, wind-packed snow, ice crust, and wet snow. The bottoms were covered with reindeer skin, arranged so the fur lay flat when moving forward but gripped when pushing back. This seems simple, but the physics involved are remarkably complex. The Sami had solved engineering problems that modern ski designers still study. But it wasn't just the skis themselves, it was how the Sami used them. They had developed a skiing technique that minimized energy expenditure while maximizing speed and control. They could maintain a steady pace for hours that would destroy the muscles of someone using incorrect form. They could stop, turn, or accelerate instantly, maneuvering through forests at speeds that seemed impossible to Vikings watching from below. A Sami hunter on skis could cover 100 miles in a day, arriving fresh enough to fight, while Vikings pursuing on foot might manage 10 miles and arrive exhausted. The Sami understanding of snow itself was encyclopedic. They had dozens of words for different types of snow, each describing specific conditions that affected movement, shelter building, tracking, and combat. They knew which snow would hold tracks and which would erase them within minutes. They knew which snow could be carved into blocks for construction and which would crumble. They could read the history of weather in snow layers like Vikings read runes, determining what had happened in a location days or weeks earlier. This knowledge extended to every aspect of the Arctic environment. The Sami knew which rocks would hold heat from the sun and radiate it at night, creating microclimates where temperature could be degrees warmer. They knew where wind patterns would create snow-free areas that animals would use for grazing, attracting prey and predators in predictable patterns. They understood how sound traveled differently in cold air, how ice formation could amplify or deaden noise, how to use natural acoustics to communicate across vast distances, or to create confusing echoes that disguised their positions. But perhaps most impressively, the Sami had learned to see things in the Arctic that were invisible to others. In the perpetual twilight of polar winter, they could navigate by the subtle color variations in snow and ice that reflected different sky conditions. They could track animals by disturbances in frost patterns that Vikings couldn't even perceive. They could predict weather changes by the way ice crystals formed on specific plants, by the behavior of insects that Vikings didn't even know existed in the Arctic, by the sounds made by ice under pressure that preceded a break by hours or days. This mastery of environment extended to their architecture. Sami structures weren't just shelters, they were engineering marvels disguised as simple tents. The lavu, their traditional dwelling, could withstand winds that would flatten Viking buildings. The design, refined over millennia, created an aerodynamic shape that actually became more stable in high winds. The central smoke hole created a pressure differential that drew fresh air in at ground level while expelling smoke, maintaining air quality even when completely sealed against storms. But here's what Vikings never understood. These structures were also weapons. The Sami could disassemble a lavu in minutes, leaving no trace they had ever been there. They could erect them in locations Vikings thought impossible, on slopes that seemed too steep, in winds that prevented normal construction. A Sami camp could appear and disappear like morning mist, there one day and gone the next, leaving Vikings to wonder if they had imagined it. The mobility this provided was a massive tactical advantage. Viking warfare was based on fixed positions, on holding territory, on establishing bases from which to operate. But the Sami had no fixed positions to attack, no territories that could be held, no bases that could be destroyed. They were everywhere and nowhere, present and absent, real and ghostly. How do you conquer people who can pack their entire civilization into sleds and disappear into a landscape that will kill you if you follow? Now we come to something that completely reshapes our understanding of the medieval Arctic. The Sami weren't isolated primitives scratching out survival in a frozen wasteland. They were at the center of one of the most extensive and valuable trade networks in medieval Europe, a network that Vikings desperately wanted to control but could never quite grasp. The Sami controlled resources that were literally worth more than gold in medieval markets. Arctic fox fur, with its incredible insulation properties and pure white color, was the ultimate status symbol for European nobility. A single Arctic fox pelt could be worth more than a horse. Ermine fur, which could only be harvested in specific conditions that the Sami understood perfectly, was reserved for royalty. The ceremonial robes of kings and popes were trimmed with furs that had passed through Sami hands. But the Sami didn't just harvest these resources. They managed them with a sophistication that modern wildlife biologists find remarkable. They understood breeding cycles, population dynamics, and habitat requirements. They practiced selective harvesting that maintained healthy populations while maximizing yield. They knew which animals to take and which to leave, when hunting would damage future populations and when it would actually improve genetic diversity. This wasn't random hunting. It was wildlife management on a scale that wouldn't be seen elsewhere in Europe for centuries. The trade networks themselves were even more impressive. The Sami were connected to markets from Greenland to Constantinople, from Novgorod to Dublin. They traded with peoples the Vikings had never even heard of, using routes through the Arctic that Vikings couldn't follow. Archaeological evidence has found Chinese silk in Sami graves, Persian silver in Sami settlements, and Islamic coins in Sami sacred sites. These weren't isolated trades, but evidence of regular, sustained commercial relationships that spanned continents. How did they maintain these networks without writing, without roads, without any of the infrastructure Vikings associated with trade? Through one of the most sophisticated oral communication systems ever developed. Sami traders could encode complex information about prices, quantities, qualities, and market conditions into joiks, their traditional songs. A single joik could contain trade intelligence that would fill pages of written text, but it would sound like nothing more than traditional music to outsiders. The Sami also understood something about economics that Vikings, with their raid and plunder mentality, never quite grasped. They recognized that controlling supply was more powerful than controlling territory. They would deliberately restrict access to certain resources, creating artificial scarcity that drove up prices. They would flood markets with inferior goods to destroy competitors, then restrict supply to restore prices. They manipulated Viking traders as effectively as they manipulated Viking warriors, using economic warfare that wouldn't be formally theorized until centuries later. But here's what really frustrated Vikings: the Sami trade network was invisible. There were no permanent markets to raid, no treasure houses to plunder, no merchant caravans to intercept. Trade happened at temporary gatherings that appeared and disappeared according to patterns Vikings couldn't predict. Goods moved through the Arctic on reindeer sleds that followed routes known only to hereditary guides. Wealth was stored not in gold and silver, but in living herds that could be moved, hidden, or dispersed at the first sign of threat. The Vikings found themselves in the humiliating position of having to buy from the Sami goods that came from territories Vikings supposedly controlled. Furs from Russian forests that Vikings claimed to rule would somehow end up in Sami hands, to be sold back to Vikings at enormous profit. Walrus ivory from waters Vikings sailed would appear in Sami markets, even though Vikings had never seen Sami boats capable of hunting walrus. The Sami had access to resources and routes that bypassed Viking control entirely, making them economically independent in ways that threatened the entire Viking economic model. Even more frustrating was the Sami refusal to be impressed by Viking wealth. When Vikings offered silver and gold for furs, the Sami would often demand iron tools instead. When Vikings displayed elaborate weapons meant to demonstrate power, the Sami would examine them with the detached interest of someone evaluating tools, not symbols. They had their own concepts of wealth and status that didn't align with Viking values, making them impossible to corrupt or co-opt through conventional means. The Sami also practiced economic warfare in ways Vikings found deeply unsettling. They would sometimes flood Viking markets with high-quality furs at low prices, causing Viking traders to invest heavily. Then supply would suddenly stop, leaving Vikings with inventory they couldn't sell and debts they couldn't pay. Other times, they would promise deliveries that never came, or deliver goods that were subtly inferior to samples, or simply disappear with advance payments, knowing Vikings couldn't pursue them into the Arctic. This economic independence, backed by military capability, created a dynamic Vikings had never encountered before. They couldn't conquer the Sami militarily, and they couldn't control them economically. Every interaction had to be negotiated, every trade carefully balanced. The Sami held cards Vikings needed, but couldn't take by force. It was a complete inversion of the power dynamics Vikings were used to, and it left them confused, frustrated, and increasingly afraid. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Sami society, and the one that Vikings found most disturbing, was their approach to information and knowledge. The Sami had developed what can only be described as spiritual technology, systems of understanding and manipulating reality that seemed like magic to outsiders, but were actually sophisticated applications of psychology, ecology, and information theory. The Noedi, Sami shamans, weren't primitive medicine men dancing around fires. They were more like living databases, human computers who could store, process, and retrieve vast amounts of information using techniques that cognitive scientists are only now beginning to understand. The drums they used, which Vikings saw as magical instruments, were actually complex information storage and retrieval devices. These drums, called runebom, were covered with symbols that represented not just physical locations, but temporal patterns, ecological relationships, and probability distributions. A trained Noadi could use the drum to calculate the likelihood of finding game in specific locations at specific times, based on weather patterns, seasonal variations, and population dynamics. They could predict where Vikings would camp based on terrain analysis and behavioral patterns. They could determine the best times for travel, trade, or warfare based on factors that included everything from stellar positions to reindeer estrus cycles. The trance states that Noadi entered weren't hallucinations, but a form of cognitive enhancement. Modern neuroscience suggests these were similar to what we now call flow states, where the brain's processing power is dramatically increased by suppressing certain conscious functions. In these states, a Noadi could integrate information from hundreds of sources, subtle changes in animal behavior, micro-variations in weather, barely perceptible sounds and smells, the accumulated observations of multiple scouts and herders. They would emerge from these trances with insights that seemed prophetic, but were actually the result of massive parallel processing of environmental data. The joik, the traditional Sami singing that Vikings found so disturbing, was another form of information technology. Each person, place, animal, and concept had its own joik, a unique acoustic signature that could be modified to convey information about its current state. A herder could joik about his reindeer and convey not just their number and location, but their health, breeding status, and behavioral patterns. A scout could joik about terrain and communicate not just geography, but tactical assessments, resource availability, and weather predictions. But joiks were more than just communication. They were also memory palaces, mnemonic devices that could store vast amounts of information in forms that could be perfectly preserved across generations. The joik for a particular valley might encode centuries of weather patterns, decades of animal migration data, and years of tactical intelligence about Viking movements. All of this information would be layered into a few minutes of vocalization that sounded like simple, traditional singing to outsiders. The Sami had also developed sophisticated psychological techniques that Vikings interpreted as magic. They understood concepts like priming, suggestion, and cognitive bias centuries before these terms were invented. They knew how to plant ideas that would grow into paranoia, how to create patterns that would make Vikings see threats everywhere, how to manipulate perception so that natural phenomena appeared supernatural. When Vikings heard their names being joiked from the darkness, it wasn't random. The Sami had gathered intelligence about which individuals were most susceptible to fear, who the informal leaders were, whose loss would most damage morale. They would target these individuals specifically, using personalized psychological attacks that seemed like magical curses, but were actually carefully crafted psychological operations. The Sami also understood something about consciousness that wouldn't be formally recognized until modern psychology, that belief shapes perception in measurable ways. They knew that if Vikings believed Sami magic was real, their brains would literally perceive evidence of that magic in ambiguous stimuli. Every unexplained sound became a spiritual attack. Every unusual weather pattern became evidence of weather magic. Every illness became a curse. The Sami didn't need actual supernatural powers when Viking beliefs would create the experience of those powers. This sophistication extended to their understanding of group psychology. The Sami knew how to create and spread panic through a Viking group, how to undermine leadership without direct confrontation, how to turn Vikings against each other through suspicion and fear. They understood that a cohesive military unit could be destroyed more effectively by attacking its social bonds than its physical bodies. As we prepare to transition to the next phase of this story, consider what we've learned so far. The Sami weren't primitive people who happened to live in a harsh environment. They were sophisticated practitioners of arts and sciences that Vikings couldn't even recognize as such. They had turned the Arctic from an obstacle into an advantage, transformed knowledge into power, and elevated survival into something approaching art. But understanding who the Sami were is only half the story. The real question is how they turned these capabilities into military advantages that stopped Viking expansion cold. How did they transform reindeer herding into cavalry tactics? How did they turn weather prediction into battle strategy? How did they make the mighty Viking military machine not just ineffective but actively self-destructive? What comes next is the part of the story that military historians are only now beginning to fully appreciate. Because the Sami didn't just defend against Vikings. They revolutionized warfare itself, developing tactics and strategies that wouldn't be seen again until the guerrilla wars of the 20th century. And they did it all without ever fielding anything that Vikings would recognize as an army. Now, I'm going to tell you something that will completely change how you think about warfare. The Sami didn't defeat Vikings in battle. They did something far more devastating. They made Vikings defeat themselves. Every strength the Vikings possessed became a weakness in Sami territory. Every tactic that had brought Vikings victory across Europe became a path to destruction in the Arctic. The Sami had figured out how to weaponize the very concept of war itself, turning Viking military doctrine into a suicide pact. What you're about to learn isn't just military history. It's the blueprint for every successful resistance movement that would follow, from the Scottish Highlands to the American Revolution to the guerrilla wars of the modern era. The Sami invented asymmetric warfare centuries before anyone gave it a name, and they did it with such sophistication that even today, military academies study their tactics as examples of perfect unconventional warfare. Let's start with how the Sami turned winter itself into a weapon system more effective than any army. Vikings understood winter. They lived in Scandinavia, after all. They knew about snow and ice and cold. But the Sami understood something else entirely. They understood that Arctic winter wasn't just a season. It was a living thing that could be directed, channeled, and unleashed on enemies with more precision than any cavalry charge. The Sami practiced what modern military theorists call environmental warfare, but their version was so sophisticated it makes modern attempts look primitive. They didn't just use the environment. They choreographed it. They could predict, with stunning accuracy, not just when winter weather would arrive, but exactly how it would behave in specific locations. Every valley, every ridge, every frozen lake had its own microclimate, its own patterns, its own deadly potential, and the Sami knew them all. Consider what happened during the attempted invasion of 1152, one of the few Viking expeditions into Sami territory that was large and well documented enough to leave clear historical evidence. 300 Viking warriors, led by Eystein Haraldsson, entered Sami territory in what they thought was late winter, the best time for travel when snow was firm and days were getting longer. What they didn't know was that the Sami had been watching them for weeks, waiting for a specific weather pattern that occurred only once or twice each winter. The Sami knew that in exactly 4 days, a warm air mass from the Atlantic would collide with cold air from Siberia directly over the valley where they would lead the Vikings. This collision would create what meteorologists now call a flash freeze event, where temperatures could drop 40 degrees in less than an hour. But the Sami knew something else, something that modern science has only recently confirmed. The human body's ability to regulate temperature degrades rapidly when subjected to sudden extreme changes. Warriors who could survive steady cold would die from the shock of rapid cooling. The Sami began their operation by appearing to flee before the Viking advance, but their flight was carefully calculated. They moved at exactly the pace needed to keep Vikings pursuing but not catching up, burning maximum calories while achieving minimum progress. They led them through terrain that looked easier than alternatives, but actually required more energy to traverse. Soft snow that looked smooth but hid uneven ground underneath. Ice that was just thin enough to crack under heavy Viking boots, but not under distributed weight of Sami skis. By the 3rd day, the Vikings were exhausted but confident. They could see the Sami camp in the distance, smoke from their fires rising in the still air. Eystein ordered his men to rest for the night and attack at dawn. They made camp in what seemed like a perfect position, an elevated area with good sightlines and natural windbreaks. What they didn't know was that this elevation would put them directly in the path of the coming temperature inversion, where cold air would pool like invisible water, creating temperatures 20 degrees colder than the surrounding area. That night, as predicted, the weather changed. But it didn't change gradually. The temperature dropped so fast that metal became dangerous to touch. Breath froze before it left the mouth, and exposed skin developed frostbite in minutes. The Vikings' fires, which should have provided warmth, became death traps. The extreme temperature differential between the fire and the surrounding air created convection currents that actually pulled heat away from bodies faster than it could be generated. Men huddled closer to fires found themselves colder, not warmer. But the Sami had prepared for this. They had positioned themselves in valleys that would be protected from the worst of the cold snap. They had built snow caves that would maintain steady temperatures regardless of outside conditions. Most importantly, they had calibrated their attack to coincide with the moment when Viking bodies would be most vulnerable, when the shock of temperature change had disrupted their metabolism, but before they could adapt. The attack, when it came, wasn't the dramatic charge Vikings expected. It was precise, clinical, almost surgical. Sami archers, positioned at calculated angles, sent arrows into the Viking camp from multiple directions. But these weren't random shots. Each archer had been assigned specific targets based on observed Viking behavior patterns. They knew which men were leaders, which were the best fighters, which were the most likely to panic. They shot in sequence, creating cascading psychological effects as Vikings saw their command structure eliminated in seconds. The Vikings tried to respond, but nothing worked as it should. Their bowstrings, made brittle by the extreme cold, snapped when drawn. Their metal weapons became so cold they stuck to hands, tearing skin when pulled away. Their armor, designed to protect, became a liability, conducting cold directly to their bodies. Men who removed gauntlets to fight found their fingers too numb to hold weapons. Those who kept gauntlets on found the metal joints frozen solid, immobilizing their hands. The Sami advanced then, but not as a mass charge. They moved in small groups, skiing in seemingly random patterns that were actually carefully coordinated. They would appear, strike, and vanish before Vikings could respond. They used the terrain's acoustic properties to make it seem like attacks were coming from impossible directions. They deployed smoke that, in the extreme cold, hung at exactly head height, blinding Vikings while Sami skied below it. By dawn, it was over. Of 300 Vikings, fewer than 50 survived, and most of those were so badly frostbitten they would never fight again. But here's the truly terrifying part. The Sami suffered no casualties, not one. They had won a battle without ever truly engaging in what Vikings would recognize as combat. They had simply arranged for winter to do their killing for them. This wasn't an isolated incident. The Sami had dozens of techniques for weaponizing winter. They knew how to create avalanches that looked natural but were triggered with precise timing. They could predict ice breaks on frozen lakes and lead enemies onto ice that would hold just long enough for Vikings to fully commit before shattering. They understood how to use whiteout conditions, where snow and sky become indistinguishable, to create sensory deprivation that would drive men mad in hours. But winter was just one weapon in the Sami arsenal. Their approach to combat itself was revolutionary, so far ahead of its time that military historians are only now fully appreciating its sophistication. The Sami had developed what we would now call guerrilla warfare, but their version included elements that wouldn't be seen again until the development of modern special forces tactics. The foundation of Sami warfare was mobility. Not just movement, but a kind of three-dimensional mobility that Vikings couldn't match or counter. On their specialized skis, Sami warriors could maintain speeds of 20 miles per hour across terrain where Vikings could barely walk. But speed was only part of it. They could change direction instantly, stop without warning, even ski backwards while shooting arrows. They had developed techniques for skiing uphill that seemed to defy physics, using skins and waxes that provided grip in one direction but not the other. This mobility allowed them to implement hit-and-run tactics, with devastating effectiveness. A group of Sami warriors could strike a Viking column, inflict casualties, and be miles away before Vikings could organize a response. But they didn't just hit and run randomly. They studied Viking march formations, identified weak points, and struck with surgical precision. They would target supply wagons, knowing that Vikings couldn't pursue without food. They would kill officers, knowing that Viking command structures were rigid and slow to adapt. They would wound rather than kill when it served their purposes, knowing that wounded men slowed an army more than dead ones. The Sami also pioneered what modern military calls shoot-and-scoot tactics. They would establish firing positions, launch volleys of arrows, and relocate before Vikings could respond. But their version was more sophisticated than simple repositioning. They would pre-position themselves at multiple locations, creating the illusion of larger numbers. They would use the terrain to create echo chambers that made it impossible to locate them by sound. They would coordinate attacks from multiple directions, forcing Vikings to defend against threats that seemed to come from everywhere at once. But perhaps most innovative was their use of what can only be called mobile defense. Instead of holding fixed positions, the Sami would retreat in patterns that drew Vikings deeper into hostile territory while exhausting them. They would fall back along routes they had prepared with obstacles invisible under snow. They would lead Vikings through areas where wind patterns would always blow against them, doubling the energy required to move. They would time their retreats so Vikings would always be making camp when weather was about to turn worse. The psychological impact of fighting an enemy you could never quite engage was devastating. Vikings were trained for shield walls, for the clash of armies, for decisive battles. But the Sami offered none of that. They were ghosts who killed from the shadows, spirits who struck and vanished, an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere. Vikings would spend days pursuing Sami forces only to realize they had been chasing echoes and shadows while the real enemy was behind them, cutting their supply lines. Now we come to something that Vikings found particularly disturbing: the Sami use of reindeer as weapons of war. These weren't just pack animals or food sources. They were living weapons systems that gave the Sami capabilities Vikings couldn't match or even fully understand. A trained war reindeer was more dangerous than any horse, more versatile than any siege weapon, and more terrifying than any berserker. First, understand that Sami reindeer weren't wild animals they occasionally hunted. These were selectively bred creatures that had been shaped by thousands of years of directed evolution. The Sami had bred different lines for different purposes, some for speed, some for strength, some for endurance, and some specifically for war. War reindeer were larger, more aggressive, and most importantly, trained from birth to respond to human commands with precision that seemed supernatural to observers. A war reindeer could carry a fully equipped warrior at speeds approaching 30 miles per hour across terrain where horses would break their legs. They could maintain this pace for hours, their broad hooves acting like natural snowshoes, their powerful legs driving through snow that would stop any other mount. But speed was just the beginning. These reindeer were trained to fight, using their antlers as weapons, their hooves as clubs, their mass as battering rams. The Sami had developed cavalry tactics, specifically adapted to reindeer capabilities. They could charge in formations that looked chaotic, but were actually precisely coordinated, each rider controlling their mount through subtle shifts in weight and pressure. They could wheel and turn as a unit, creating moving walls of antlers and hooves that no infantry formation could withstand. They could scatter instantly and reform just as quickly, making them impossible to target with conventional tactics. But the real genius was in how the Sami used reindeer psychologically. Vikings had no frame of reference for fighting mounted reindeer. Horses they understood, but reindeer were something else entirely. The sound of hundreds of reindeer hooves on frozen ground created frequencies that induced panic in humans, a deep drumming that seemed to come from the earth itself. The sight of reindeer charging with their antlers lowered, their breath steaming in the cold air, their eyes reflecting light in ways that seemed unnatural, triggered primal fears that warrior training couldn't suppress. The Sami would sometimes use reindeer in ways that seemed to confirm Viking beliefs about magic. They would release trained reindeer that would move through Viking camps at night, following pre-planned routes, creating the illusion of supernatural visitation. They would use reindeer calls to make it seem like the animals were speaking, communicating messages that Vikings couldn't understand but felt compelled to interpret as omens. There was also the stampede tactic, one of the most feared Sami weapons. They would position large herds of semi-wild reindeer upslope from Viking positions, then trigger controlled stampedes that would sweep down like avalanches of flesh and bone. Hundreds of reindeer running at full speed, their antlers creating an interlocking wall of destruction, could shatter any formation, destroy any camp, turn any battlefield into chaos. Vikings caught in a reindeer stampede faced a horrible choice: stand and be trampled or run and be hunted by the Sami warriors following behind the herd. The Sami also used reindeer as intelligence assets. The animals' senses were far superior to humans in Arctic conditions. They could smell predators, including humans, from over a mile away. They could hear frequencies humans couldn't detect. They could sense weather changes hours before they became apparent to human senses. A Sami warrior with a trained reindeer had access to sensory information that seemed like supernatural awareness to Vikings. But perhaps most cleverly, the Sami used reindeer to control territory without occupying it. They would release herds into areas they wanted to deny to Vikings. These herds would consume all available grazing, foul water sources with their waste, and create enough disturbance to drive away other game. Vikings entering these areas would find themselves in biological deserts, unable to hunt, unable to find clean water, unable to survive off the land. The Sami had turned herbivores into area denial weapons. The economic aspect of reindeer warfare was equally important. Every reindeer killed by Vikings was an economic loss the Sami could afford, but Vikings couldn't understand. The Sami knew exactly how many reindeer they could lose while maintaining their herds. They knew which animals were expendable and which were crucial breeding stock. They could sacrifice hundreds of reindeer in military operations, while actually strengthening their herds by culling weaker animals. Vikings, used to measuring military success by enemy casualties, couldn't comprehend that killing reindeer might actually be helping their enemies. As we shift focus from physical to psychological warfare, remember that everything I've described so far was just the visible part of Sami tactics. The real war was being fought in a realm Vikings could barely perceive, the battlefield of the mind. Because the Sami understood something that wouldn't be formally recognized by military science for centuries. They understood that breaking an enemy's will to fight was more effective than breaking their bodies. The Sami approach to psychological warfare was so sophisticated that modern military psychologists study it as an early example of what's now called cognitive warfare. They didn't just try to frighten Vikings, though fear was certainly a tool they used. They sought to fundamentally undermine Viking understanding of reality, to make them question everything they believed about the world, about war, about themselves. The campaign would begin long before any physical confrontation. The Sami would ensure that Vikings heard stories about their territory, but not just any stories. They would plant specific narratives designed to create expectations that could then be manipulated. They would spread tales of impossible victories, of warriors who could fly, of drums that could kill with sound alone. These stories would be dismissed as superstition by Viking leaders, but would lodge in the minds of common warriors, creating unconscious expectations that the Sami would later exploit. When Vikings entered Sami territory, the psychological operations would intensify. The Sami used sound as a weapon in ways Vikings had never encountered. They would create acoustic effects using the natural properties of the landscape, making voices seem to come from inside Viking heads, creating rhythms that disrupted sleep patterns, generating frequencies that induced anxiety and paranoia. Modern acoustic science has confirmed that certain frequencies can trigger fear responses in humans, and the Sami had discovered these frequencies through centuries of experimentation. The visual psychological warfare was equally sophisticated. The Sami would leave objects for Vikings to find, but these weren't random items. They were carefully chosen to trigger specific psychological responses. A child's toy made from materials that shouldn't exist in the Arctic. A piece of clothing that looked exactly like something owned by a Viking's family member hundreds of miles away. arrangements of stones that almost formed runic messages but not quite, forcing Vikings to spend mental energy trying to decode meaning that might not exist. The Sami also mastered the art of gaslighting, though that term wouldn't exist for centuries. They would subtly alter Viking camps while the occupants slept. Nothing dramatic, just small changes that would make Vikings question their memories. Objects moved slightly, footprints that appeared inside circles of guards. Food that tasted different, though it looked the same. These minor alterations accumulated, creating a sense that reality itself was unreliable in Sami territory. Sleep deprivation was another weapon in the psychological arsenal. The Sami knew that humans deprived of proper sleep for even a few days begin to hallucinate, become paranoid, and lose the ability to make rational decisions. They would ensure Vikings never got proper rest, using irregular patterns of disturbance that prevented deep sleep cycles. Not constant harassment, which Vikings could adapt to, but random interruptions that made real rest impossible. But the most sophisticated psychological weapon was the joik, the traditional Sami singing that Vikings found so deeply disturbing. The Sami had discovered that certain vocal patterns could trigger specific emotional responses in listeners, regardless of language or cultural background. They could joik in ways that induced homesickness so intense it became physically painful. They could create vocal patterns that made listeners feel they were being watched, even in empty rooms. They could sing frequencies that interfered with the brain's ability to process spatial information, making Vikings feel lost even in familiar territory. The Sami would joik the names of individual Vikings, but not randomly. They would identify through intelligence gathering which Vikings were crucial to unit cohesion, which were informal leaders, which were most susceptible to fear. These individuals would hear their names joiked from the darkness, sometimes in voices that sounded like deceased relatives, sometimes in tones that suggested knowledge of their deepest secrets. The effect was devastating. Strong warriors would break down, convinced their souls were being stolen. The temporal aspect of psychological warfare was equally important. The Sami understood that uncertainty about time was deeply unsettling to humans. In the Arctic, where the sun might not rise for weeks or might not set for weeks, keeping track of time was already difficult. The Sami would deliberately manipulate temporal cues to make Vikings lose track of how long they had been in Sami territory. They would create false dawns with fires, extend darkness with smoke, make hours feel like days, and days feel like hours. What's about to come next is perhaps the most remarkable part of this entire story. Because despite everything I've told you, despite the fear and the tactics and the psychological warfare, the Vikings and Sami eventually developed one of the most unusual relationships in medieval history. It wasn't peace, and it wasn't war. It was something else entirely, something that reveals truths about both cultures that traditional histories have tried to hide. But before we get to that, you need to understand the specific incidents that finally convinced Vikings that the Sami could never be conquered, the battles that weren't really battles, the victories that were actually defeats, the moments when Viking strength became Viking weakness, and the only winning move was not to play at all. What I'm about to tell you now are the specific incidents that finally broke Viking will to conquer the Sami. These aren't legends or sagas filled with supernatural elements. These are documented historical events with archaeological evidence, tax records, and multiple independent sources. And they reveal something extraordinary. The Sami didn't just win occasional victories against the Vikings. They systematically dismantled every attempt at conquest so thoroughly that Vikings eventually gave up trying. But the way they did it will challenge everything you thought you knew about medieval warfare. The most revealing encounters happened in Hålogaland, the northernmost Viking settlement in Norway. This wasn't some remote outpost, but a thriving centre of power, home to some of Norway's wealthiest and most influential jarls. From here, Vikings launched their attempts to control Sami territory and extract tribute. What happened instead became a centuries-long lesson in the limits of conventional power. The Hålogaland jarls thought they had every advantage. They controlled the coast, giving them access to ships and trade routes. They had iron weapons and armor, while the Sami primarily used bone and wood. They had agricultural surpluses that could support standing armies, while the Sami were nomadic herders. They had written laws and administrative systems, while the Sami relied on oral tradition. By every measure Vikings used to assess power, they should have dominated. The reality was completely different. The first documented attempt to subjugate the Sami from Hålogaland came in 871, led by Thorir Hund, whose name literally meant Thor's dog, and who had earned fame raiding in Ireland. He assembled 200 warriors and marched north, planning to establish permanent Norwegian control over Sami reindeer herds and force regular tribute payments. He had studied previous failures and believed he had identified the key to victory: speed. Previous expeditions had moved slowly, giving Sami time to prepare. Thorir would strike fast before they could organize resistance, but the Sami had been watching Thorir's preparations for months. Through their trade networks, they knew exactly how many men he had, what supplies they carried, even what route they planned to take. As Thorir's force entered Sami territory, they found exactly what they expected to find: scattered camps, grazing reindeer, signs of recent habitation. It looked like they had achieved surprise. In reality, they were walking into a trap that had been months in preparation. The Sami had left behind what appeared to be hastily abandoned camps, but everything was deliberately placed. The food left in pots was contaminated with substances that wouldn't cause immediate illness but would weaken the Vikings over days. The shelters were positioned to look defensible, but actually channeled wind in ways that made them impossible to heat properly. The reindeer trails led in directions that looked promising, but actually went deeper into areas the Sami had prepared for defense. For 3 days, Thorir pursued what he thought was a fleeing population. His men were making good time, morale was high, and they had already captured enough reindeer to consider the expedition profitable. On the 4th day, they reached what appeared to be a major Sami settlement, recently abandoned. There were dozens of lavu frames, storage platforms full of supplies, even what looked like a ceremonial site with drums and other valuable items. Thorir ordered his men to make camp and inventory their prizes. That night, the temperature dropped 50 degrees in 3 hours. This wasn't random weather, but a predictable phenomenon the Sami knew occurred in that specific valley when certain atmospheric conditions aligned. The Vikings' fires couldn't generate enough heat. Their water supplies froze solid. Men began showing signs of severe hypothermia within hours. And then, at the moment of maximum vulnerability, the Sami attacked. But calling it an attack doesn't capture what really happened. The Sami didn't charge or engage in battle. They simply appeared at the edges of firelight and began shooting arrows with mechanical precision. Every shot was aimed at a specific target: fire tenders who kept the flames going, sentries who might raise alarms, leaders who might organize resistance. Within minutes, Viking organization collapsed. Men fled into the darkness, where Sami on skis hunted them down individually. By dawn, Thorir's force had ceased to exist as a military unit. Thorir himself survived, but only because the Sami wanted him to. They needed someone to carry the message back to Hålogaland, but they did something to him first that Vikings found more terrifying than death. They performed a ceremony, marking him with symbols cut into his skin, speaking words in their language, while drums beat in rhythms that seemed to reach inside his chest. When Thorir returned to Hålogaland, he was changed. He would speak suddenly in languages he didn't know. He could predict weather changes days in advance. He knew things about people he had never met. The Vikings didn't have words for post-traumatic stress disorder, but they recognized that Thorir had been broken in ways that weapons couldn't achieve. The Hålogaland Jarls tried different approaches over the following decades. They tried negotiation, sending diplomats who never returned or came back, speaking of boundaries that couldn't be crossed. They tried bribery, offering wealth for safe passage, only to find their silver and gold returned with messages that some things couldn't be bought. They tried infiltration, sending spies who either disappeared entirely or returned as double agents. Their loyalties mysteriously shifted. The archaeological record from Hålogaland reveals the impact of these failed attempts. Grave goods from the period show a marked decline in wealth, suggesting economic disruption from lost expeditions. Building patterns change, with structures moving away from the northern borders, creating a buffer zone that Vikings wouldn't enter. Most tellingly, religious artifacts begin showing Sami influence. Drum-like objects in Viking graves, bare teeth arranged in Sami patterns, evidence of rituals that combined Norse and Sami practices. But Hologaland also reveals something else, evidence of trade. Despite the violence and fear, Vikings and Sami were simultaneously developing complex economic relationships. The same Jarls who couldn't conquer the Sami were buying their furs, hiring their guides, even intermarrying with them in some cases. It was a relationship unlike anything else in Viking society. Enemies who couldn't be conquered, trading partners who couldn't be controlled, neighbours who couldn't be understood. Now we come to one of the most fascinating aspects of Sami Viking encounters, the battles that weren't battles, the conflicts that defied every Viking understanding of warfare. These incidents reveal just how sophisticated Sami tactics were, and why Vikings eventually concluded that conventional military thinking simply didn't apply in the Arctic. The most famous non-battle occurred in 1043, recorded in multiple sources including the Heimskringla. King Magnus I of Norway, called Magnus the Good, decided to establish Norwegian sovereignty over Sami territories once and for all. He assembled not just warriors, but administrators, intending to create permanent Norwegian settlements that would control Sami movements and extract regular tribute. This wasn't a raid but an occupation, planned with the thoroughness that had succeeded in other territories. Magnus sent 500 men, including engineers who could build fortifications, scribes who could establish administrative systems, and priests who could begin conversion efforts. They were to establish 3 fortified settlements in strategic locations that would control reindeer migration routes. The plan was brilliant by conventional standards. Control the migration routes, control the reindeer, control the reindeer, control the Sami. It was the same strategy that had worked with agricultural populations throughout Europe. The expedition made good progress initially. They established their first fortification without opposition, built solid structures that could withstand Arctic winters, and began sending out patrols to map the surrounding territory. For 2 weeks, they didn't see a single Sami. The commander, Sigurd Slembe, began to believe they had achieved strategic surprise. He was wrong. The Sami were watching, waiting, preparing something that Vikings had no framework for understanding. On the 15th day, Sigurd woke to find his fortification surrounded by reindeer, not a few dozen or even a few hundred. Thousands of reindeer, standing perfectly still, forming concentric circles around the Norwegian settlement. They weren't attacking or even moving. They were just standing there, watching, their breath creating a fog that obscured vision beyond a few meters. It was impossible. Reindeer didn't behave this way, yet there they were. The Vikings tried to drive them off, but the reindeer wouldn't move. They tried to kill them, but for every one that fell, others seemed to take its place. They tried to ignore them, but the psychological pressure of being surrounded by thousands of watching eyes was unbearable. And then the reindeer began to move. Not chaotically, but in patterns, creating corridors and walls, shepherding Vikings into specific areas of their own fortification. That night, the drumming started, but it wasn't coming from outside the fortification. It was coming from inside, from the very ground beneath Viking feet. The Sami had somehow positioned drums underground before the Vikings arrived, creating resonance chambers that turned the entire fortification into a massive speaker. The sound was inescapable, penetrating, maddening. It went on for 3 days without stopping. By the 4th day, Vikings were beginning to break. Some claimed they could understand the drums, that they were hearing messages meant specifically for them. Others insisted the reindeer were talking to them, telling them to leave. Still, others began performing Sami rituals they shouldn't have known, drawing symbols in the dirt, singing joiks they had never heard. The organized military unit was dissolving into chaos without a single arrow being fired. On the 5th day, Sigurd made the only decision he could. He ordered a retreat, but when the Vikings tried to leave, they found that the reindeer had eaten or trampled all the vegetation for miles around. Every potential camping site had been fouled with waste. Every water source was contaminated. The retreat became a nightmare march through a biological desert, harassed by Sami who never quite attacked but never let them rest. Of 500 men who entered Sami territory, fewer than 200 returned to Norwegian territory, and many of those were permanently changed by their experience. The fortification they had built was dismantled completely, not a single timber left standing. It was as if it had never existed. The message was clear: you cannot occupy what you cannot understand. This pattern repeated across decades. Vikings would establish what seemed like successful settlements, only to have them dissolved by methods that defied military logic. Sometimes it was economic warfare, with Sami ensuring that no game came near Viking settlements, that fish disappeared from streams, that even moss and lichen seemed to avoid Viking-controlled areas. Sometimes it was biological warfare, with diseases that affected only Vikings, that responded to no treatment, that disappeared the moment Vikings left Sami territory. The Sami had turned the very concept of occupation into a trap. Every Viking settlement required massive resources to maintain, resources that had to be imported at enormous cost. Meanwhile, the Sami continued their nomadic lifestyle, unaffected by Viking presence, moving through occupied territory as if the occupiers didn't exist. Vikings found themselves controlling empty land, while the Sami controlled everything that made the land valuable. But the Sami weren't fighting alone. One of the most important factors in their successful resistance was their alliance with other Finnic peoples, particularly the Karelians. This network of indigenous peoples created a defensive alliance that Vikings found impossible to break. And the way this alliance operated reveals another layer of sophistication in Sami resistance. The Karelians controlled territory to the east of the Sami, regions that are now part of Finland and Russia. Like the Sami, they had developed survival strategies perfectly adapted to their environment. But unlike the Sami, they had more experience with conventional warfare, having fought against Slavic expansion for centuries. The combination of Sami unconventional tactics and Karelian conventional military knowledge created a hybrid form of warfare that Vikings had never encountered. When Vikings attempted to bypass Sami territory by going through Karelian lands, they found coordinated resistance. The Karelians would engage Vikings in conventional battles, the kind of fighting Vikings understood and excelled at. But just when Vikings seemed to be winning, Sami forces would appear on their flanks or rear, using their mobility and unconventional tactics to turn Viking victories into defeats. The intelligence sharing between Sami and Karelians was remarkable. Information about Viking movements would travel hundreds of miles in days, faster than the Vikings themselves could move. This wasn't magic, but a sophisticated communication network using drums, smoke signals, and human messengers who knew routes through the Arctic that Vikings couldn't follow. A Viking force entering Karelian territory would find that their strength, composition, and intentions were already known to defenders hundreds of miles away. The economic cooperation was equally important. Sami furs would reach European markets through Karelian middlemen, bypassing Viking control. Karelian iron would reach Sami craftsmen, giving them access to materials Vikings had tried to deny them. This economic network was so efficient that Vikings often found themselves buying goods that had originated in territories they claimed to control, sold to them by the very people they were trying to conquer. The spiritual alliance was perhaps most significant. Sami Noadi and Karelian shamans would conduct joint ceremonies, combining their traditions in ways that created new forms of practice. Vikings reported seeing impossible things during these ceremonies. Men who could be in two places at once. Animals that spoke in human voices. Weather that obeyed human commands. Whether these were hallucinations, psychological operations, or something else entirely, the effect on Viking morale was devastating. But perhaps the most important result of the Sami-Karelian alliance was strategic. It created a defensive depth that Vikings couldn't penetrate. Even if they somehow defeated the Sami, they would face the Karelians. If they defeated the Karelians, the Sami would attack their supply lines. The two peoples covered each other's weaknesses and amplified each other's strengths. It was an early example of what modern military theorists call defense in depth, but implemented with a sophistication that wouldn't be seen again until the 20th century. The archaeological evidence of this alliance is compelling. We find Sami artifacts in Karelian settlements and Karelian goods in Sami sites. More importantly, we find evidence of coordinated resistance, fortifications built simultaneously across hundreds of miles, weapons caches positioned to support joint operations, and most tellingly, Viking settlements that were abandoned at the same time across both Sami and Karelian territories, suggesting coordinated pressure that made occupation untenable. Now we reach the ultimate proof of Sami success, the complete failure of Norwegian royal power to establish any meaningful control over Sami territory. These weren't minor chieftains or ambitious jarls. These were kings at the height of their power, men who had successfully conquered and integrated other territories, who had defeated armies across Europe. Yet they all failed against the Sami, and their failures reveal the true extent of Sami sophistication. King Harald Hardrada, often considered the last great Viking king, made 3 attempts to subjugate the Sami between 1048 and 1064. This was a man who had served in the Byzantine Emperor's Varangian Guard, who had fought in Sicily, Jerusalem, and Bulgaria. He had seen every form of warfare the medieval world could offer, yet he couldn't defeat reindeer herders in his own backyard. His first expedition ended when his entire cavalry force, the pride of Norwegian military might, was neutralized by a reindeer stampede that scattered horses for miles. His second attempt failed when Sami weather predictors guided a blizzard directly into his camp, burying tons of supplies and forcing a humiliating retreat. His third attempt never even reached Sami territory proper, turned back by an outbreak of what chroniclers called the madness disease, which caused hallucinations and paranoia, but affected only Norwegians. King Olaf III, known as Olaf the Peaceful, tried a different approach. Instead of military conquest, he attempted cultural absorption, sending missionaries to convert the Sami to Christianity. The missionaries either disappeared entirely or returned as converts to Sami shamanism, claiming they had discovered older and more powerful truths. One missionary, Bishop Grimkel, returned speaking in tongues that linguists couldn't identify, insisting that the Christian God and Sami spirits were the same beings seen from different angles. The church declared him mad and had him confined, but his writings, which survive in fragments, suggest a complex theological synthesis that threatened the very foundations of Norse Christianity. King Magnus III, called Magnus Barefoot, made the last serious attempt at conquest in 1102. He had successfully conquered parts of Ireland and Scotland, earning a reputation as one of the most effective military commanders of his age. His approach to the Sami was methodical and brutal. He would take hostages from border communities, forcing cooperation through threat. He would destroy Sami sacred sites, believing that breaking their spiritual power would break their resistance. He would use scorched earth tactics, killing reindeer herds to deny the Sami resources. But everything Magnus did backfired. The hostages he took either escaped using methods that seemed impossible, walking through walls according to some accounts, or they converted their captors to Sami ways of thinking. The sacred sites he destroyed seemed to regenerate, with new sites appearing faster than he could destroy them. The reindeer herds he slaughtered were replaced by others that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. His scorched earth tactics only freed the Sami from the need to protect fixed resources, making them more mobile and harder to pin down. Magnus's final expedition ended in personal tragedy. His son, also named Magnus, accompanied him into Sami territory. The younger Magnus disappeared one night from a guarded tent, taken despite dozens of warriors standing watch. He was found 3 days later, physically unharmed but fundamentally changed. He could no longer speak Norse, only a dialect that seemed to be part Sami, part something else. He showed no recognition of his father or his former life. He would spend the rest of his days in a monastery, drawing intricate patterns that hurt to look at and singing songs that made listeners weep without knowing why. After Magnus Barefoot's failure, Norwegian kings essentially gave up trying to conquer the Sami. They shifted to a policy of containment and negotiation, treating the Sami not as subjects to be ruled, but as neighbours to be managed. Tax records from the period show a dramatic shift. Instead of demanding tribute from the Sami, Norwegian authorities begin paying for Sami services, guides, weather prediction, diplomatic missions to other Arctic peoples. The conquered had become contractors. The subjects had become specialists whose skills were too valuable to lose through continued conflict. What you're about to learn next changes everything about how we understand the outcome of this centuries-long conflict. Because the Vikings didn't just fail to conquer the Sami, they ended up in a relationship that defied every convention of medieval power dynamics. The Sami had achieved something that should have been impossible. They had turned their would-be conquerors into protectors, their enemies into dependents, their resistance into a form of control that shaped the entire future of Scandinavia. What happened next is the part of the story that historians tried to hide for centuries. The Vikings didn't just stop trying to conquer the Sami. They entered into an arrangement so unusual, so contrary to everything we think we know about medieval power, that chronicles from the period literally don't have words to describe it. The Vikings, who extracted tribute from kingdoms across Europe through force and fear, ended up paying the Sami for the privilege of existing near them. But that's not even the most shocking part. The most shocking part is that this arrangement made both peoples wealthier and more powerful than they had ever been before. By the early 12th century, a remarkable transformation had occurred in the relationship between Vikings and Sami. The evidence is hidden in trade records, tax documents, and archaeological finds that scholars dismissed for decades because they didn't fit the narrative of Viking dominance. But when you piece together these fragments, a picture emerges that completely redefines our understanding of medieval Arctic economics and power. The transformation began with a simple recognition by Viking leaders. They needed the Sami more than the Sami needed them. This wasn't just about furs and ivory anymore, though those remained valuable. The Vikings had discovered that Sami knowledge and capabilities were essential for their own expansion into the North Atlantic. Every Viking expedition to Iceland, Greenland, and eventually North America depended on navigation techniques learned from the Sami. Every Viking settlement in the far north survived because of Sami knowledge about Arctic agriculture, construction, and resource management. The economic arrangement that developed was unlike anything else in medieval Europe. Officially, the Sami paid tribute to Norwegian kings. The sagas record this, the tax records show it, the formal histories all agree, but when you look at what actually happened, the reality was completely different. The tribute the Sami paid was carefully calculated to be less than the value of services they provided in return. They would deliver furs worth 100 marks of silver and receive gifts of iron tools worth 200 marks. They would provide guides for expeditions and be compensated at rates that would make modern consultants jealous. The Norwegian crown essentially subsidized Sami independence while maintaining the fiction of sovereignty. Kings who couldn't conquer the Sami militarily conquered them bureaucratically, on paper only. The Sami played along with this fiction because it gave them access to European markets, protection from other potential invaders, and most importantly, recognition of their territorial rights. They had turned tribute into trade, submission into partnership, conquest into contract. The numbers tell the real story. Archaeological evidence from Sami sites dating to this period shows a dramatic increase in wealth. We find Arabic silver, Byzantine gold, English wool, and Frankish weapons. Not the scattered coins that might indicate occasional trade, but hoards that suggest systematic accumulation of wealth. Meanwhile, Norwegian settlements near Sami territories show increasing dependence on Sami goods and services. The conquerors had become customers. The Sami also developed what can only be described as an early form of monopoly capitalism. They controlled resources that Vikings desperately wanted but couldn't obtain elsewhere. Arctic fox fur, for example, could only be harvested in specific conditions that the Sami understood perfectly. They would restrict supply to drive up prices, flood markets to destroy competitors, and use their control of Arctic resources to influence European politics. When the King of England wanted ermine for his coronation robes, those furs passed through Sami hands. When the Pope needed walrus ivory for religious artifacts, the Sami determined whether he would get it. But the economic influence went even deeper. The Sami introduced Vikings to trade routes and partners that transformed Scandinavian commerce. Through their connections with Siberian peoples, the Sami provided access to Asian goods that wouldn't otherwise reach Europe for centuries. Through their knowledge of Arctic sea routes, they enabled Viking expeditions that would have been impossible otherwise. The Viking age of exploration wasn't just Viking, it was a joint venture with the Sami as silent partners. The protection arrangement that developed was even more remarkable. Viking lords began hiring Sami warriors not to fight against other Vikings, but against other European powers. Sami units served in Viking armies that fought in Ireland, Scotland, and Russia, but they served as specialists, not regular troops. They were scouts who could track enemies across any terrain, weather predictors who could anticipate battlefield conditions, and most valuably, psychological warfare experts who could break enemy morale without conventional combat. There are accounts of Sami units in Viking armies causing entire enemy forces to flee without fighting. The reputation they had earned in the Arctic preceded them. European knights, who would charge into battle against overwhelming odds, would retreat when they heard Sami drums. Irish warriors, who had fought Vikings for generations, would negotiate when they learned Sami shamans were present. The Sami had become a force multiplier that made Viking armies far more effective than their numbers would suggest. Now we come to something that Norwegian nationalists spent centuries trying to erase: the profound influence Sami culture had on Viking society. This wasn't just borrowing a few techniques or trading for goods. This was deep cultural exchange that fundamentally changed Norse religion, philosophy, and worldview. The Vikings, who supposedly conquered and culturally dominated everyone they encountered, were themselves transformed by the people they couldn't conquer. The influence started with practical knowledge, but quickly went deeper. Vikings living near Sami territories began adopting Sami practices that had nothing to do with Arctic survival. They started using drums in their own religious ceremonies. They incorporated joik-like elements into their poetry. They adopted Sami concepts about the relationship between humans and nature that contradicted traditional Norse beliefs. Archaeological evidence from the period shows Viking graves with Sami spiritual symbols, Viking homes with Sami architectural features, Viking art with Sami aesthetic influences. The religious impact was particularly significant. Norse mythology from areas near Sami territories shows clear Sami influence. The concept of seidr, the Norse magical practice that was considered feminine and somewhat shameful for men, appears to be directly borrowed from Sami shamanism. The idea that certain individuals could travel between worlds, commune with spirits, and see the future, all central to later Norse mythology, have clear parallels in Sami spiritual practices that predate Viking contact. Even Odin himself shows Sami influence. The All-Father's ability to change shapes, his association with wisdom gained through suffering, his use of ravens as messengers, all have parallels in Sami shamanic traditions. Some scholars argue that Odin, as he appears in later sources, is actually a synthesis of older Germanic gods and Sami spiritual concepts. The Vikings didn't just fail to convert the Sami to their religion. The Sami partially converted the Vikings to theirs. The linguistic influence was equally profound. Old Norse from regions near Sami territories contains hundreds of Sami loanwords, not just for Arctic phenomena, but for abstract concepts. Words for certain types of knowledge, for spiritual states, for ways of understanding time and space, all borrowed from Sami languages. The Vikings, who prided themselves on their skaldic poetry, were learning new ways to use language from people they had dismissed as primitive. But perhaps most significantly, the Sami influenced Viking concepts of power and success. Traditional Viking society measured success by expansion, conquest, and accumulation. The Sami modelled a different form of success: sustainability, adaptation, and balance. Some Viking communities near Sami territories began adopting these values, creating hybrid societies that were neither fully Norse nor fully Sami, but something new. The geographical impact of Sami resistance shaped the entire map of medieval Scandinavia and beyond. This is the part of the story that completely reframes our understanding of Viking expansion. The Vikings didn't just choose to expand west into the Atlantic and east into Russia. They were pushed in those directions by their inability to expand north into Sami territories. The Sami didn't just defend their own lands. They redirected the entire course of Scandinavian history. Look at a map of Viking settlements, and you'll see something remarkable. They extend in every direction except true north. Vikings sailed thousands of miles across open ocean to reach Iceland. They travelled down Russian rivers to the Black Sea. They portaged ships across land to reach new waterways. But they wouldn't go a few hundred miles north into territories they could see from their own settlements. The Sami had created an impenetrable barrier that forced Viking expansion into channels that would define European history. This redirection had massive historical consequences. If Vikings had been able to conquer and settle Sami territories, they might never have developed the maritime technologies that allowed them to reach North America. They might never have established the trade routes through Russia that connected Europe to Asia. They might never have created the settlements in Iceland that preserved Germanic literary traditions that would otherwise have been lost. The Sami, by successfully resisting, forced Vikings to become the seafaring explorers we remember them as. The buffer zone, created by Sami resistance, also shaped the development of national boundaries in Scandinavia. The unclear, contested border between Norse and Sami territories became the template for borders between Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. These weren't lines drawn by conquest, but zones of interaction negotiated over centuries. The modern map of Northern Europe exists partly because the Sami couldn't be conquered and wouldn't be moved. The Sami also influenced Viking expansion in more subtle ways. Viking leaders who had failed against the Sami often redirected their ambitions elsewhere, leading to raids and conquests that might not otherwise have happened. The psychological need to prove themselves after being humiliated by reindeer herders drove some Vikings to extraordinary feats of conquest in other lands. The Viking Age itself might have been less aggressive, less expansive, if Vikings hadn't needed to compensate for their failure in the north. The legacy of Sami resistance extends far beyond the medieval period. The Sami proved something that would inspire resistance movements for centuries to come. Empires have limits, conventional military superiority can be negated, and indigenous knowledge can defeat foreign technology. Every successful guerrilla movement, every effective resistance to colonization, every asymmetric conflict where the supposedly weaker side prevailed, owes something to the template the Sami created. The Sami also demonstrated that survival doesn't require dominance. They never tried to conquer Viking territories, never built an empire, never expanded beyond the lands they knew how to inhabit sustainably. They proved that defense could be more powerful than offense, that knowing your home ground perfectly could defeat any invader, that patience and persistence could outlast aggression and ambition. These lessons would resonate through history, influencing everything from Swiss neutrality to Vietnamese resistance to colonial powers. But perhaps most importantly, the Sami showed that cultural survival was possible even against overwhelming pressure. Despite centuries of attempted conquest, conversion, and assimilation, they maintained their languages, their traditions, their ways of life. They adapted without surrendering, changed without losing themselves, engaged with conquerors without being conquered. This model of cultural resilience would inspire indigenous peoples worldwide facing similar pressures. What you need to understand as we approach the end of this story is that the Sami victory wasn't just military or even cultural, it was existential. They proved that there were different ways to exist in the world, different definitions of success, different forms of strength. They challenged not just Viking armies, but Viking assumptions about reality itself. And in doing so, they changed not just their own history, but the history of everyone they encountered. The story concludes with a twist that no one could have predicted. The Vikings, the great conquerors of the medieval world, ended up being conquered themselves. Not by armies or empires, but by time and change. Their age ended, their gods forgotten, their way of life extinct. But the Sami are still there, still herding reindeer along paths older than history. Still singing joiks that encode memories from before the pyramids, still living in the Arctic that no one else could tame. The unconquered remain unconquered, having outlasted their would-be conquerors by centuries. So what really happened to that Viking expedition in 1026, the one that vanished without a trace, leaving only abandoned equipment and strange symbols carved in the snow? The truth, pieced together from archaeological evidence and Sami oral histories preserved across 1,000 years, is both simpler and more profound than any supernatural explanation. And it reveals the ultimate genius of Sami resistance. The expedition wasn't destroyed by magic or curses. It was systematically dismantled using every technique the Sami had perfected over centuries of resistance. The psychological warfare began weeks before the Vikings even knew they were being watched. The Sami identified the expedition's leaders, its strongest fighters, its weakest links. They learned names, personalities, fears. When the operation began, it was precisely targeted to destroy not just bodies, but the very concept of Viking superiority. The symbols in the snow weren't mystical warnings. They were messages in Sami pictographic writing that translated roughly to, "You are walking where you should not walk," and "Your names are known to us." But to Vikings who couldn't read them, who could only feel their alien presence, they might as well have been curses from another world. The abandoned weapons, arranged in strange patterns, were positioned to tell a story. "We could have taken these, but chose not to, because your weapons mean nothing here." The missing bodies were never found because the Sami, following ancient traditions about spiritual pollution, had moved them far from their territorial boundaries. Not out of cruelty, but out of a belief that foreign dead would contaminate the land. They were placed, according to oral histories, in a deep crevasse that would eventually be sealed by ice, a burial that was respectful but ensured they would never be recovered. To the Vikings waiting for news, it seemed like the land itself had swallowed their comrades. But here's what makes this story matter today, right now, as you're listening to this. The Sami victory over the Vikings has been systematically erased from popular history, not accidentally, but deliberately. And the reasons for that erasure tell us something crucial about how history gets written and whose stories get told. When Scandinavian nationalism rose in the 19th century, countries like Norway and Sweden needed heroes. They needed evidence of their historical greatness. The Vikings were perfect, warriors who had conquered from Ireland to Russia, explorers who had reached North America centuries before Columbus, traders who had connected Europe to Asia. But the Sami complicated this narrative. How could your ancestors be invincible warriors if they couldn't conquer the reindeer herders living right next to them? So, the story was rewritten. The Sami were transformed from successful military opponents into primitive nomads who peacefully coexisted with their Norse neighbours. Their sophisticated resistance tactics were dismissed as luck or weather. Their complex society was reduced to simple herding. Their victory was erased and replaced with a fiction of peaceful integration that never actually happened. This erasure had real consequences. It justified centuries of oppression, forced assimilation, and cultural destruction. If the Sami were primitive peoples who had been peacefully absorbed into Scandinavian society, then forcing them to abandon their languages, their religions, their ways of life was just helping them modernize. The lie about the past became justification for crimes in the present. But the truth cannot be hidden forever. Archaeological evidence keeps surfacing that confirms what Sami oral histories always maintained. Advanced metallurgy that shouldn't have existed in the Arctic, trade networks that spanned continents, military victories that Norwegian kings tried to hide. Each discovery forces us to reconsider not just Sami history, but the entire narrative of European development. The Sami story challenges our most basic assumptions about progress and power. We're taught that agricultural societies always defeat hunter-gatherers, that written language always beats oral tradition, that empires always expand until they meet other empires. The Sami proved all of that wrong. They showed that there are other ways to be strong, other definitions of victory, other forms of civilization that we've been trained not to see. They also demonstrated something that feels especially relevant in our current moment. The Sami proved that you don't need to become your enemy to defeat them. They never adopted Viking military structures. never tried to build their own empire, never abandoned their sustainable ways of life for Viking models of success. They won by being themselves, only more so. They defeated conquest by refusing to play the conquest game. Today, the Sami are still here. After surviving Vikings, surviving medieval kingdoms, surviving forced assimilation, surviving industrial exploitation, they're still here. They still herd reindeer along migration routes older than any European kingdom. They still speak languages that encode ways of understanding the world that exist nowhere else. They still remember, in songs and stories, the time when the most feared warriors in European history came to their lands and were sent running by people whose strength came not from swords but from knowledge, not from armies but from adaptation, not from conquest but from connection to the land itself. The Viking Age ended almost 1,000 years ago. The great longships rotted away, the mighty fortresses crumbled, the feared warriors became footnotes in history books. But on cold Arctic nights, when the northern lights dance across the sky, you can still hear Sami drums echoing across the tundra. Still hear joiks that carry memories from before written history. Still see people living lives that would be recognizable to ancestors from 10,000 years ago. That's not just survival, that's victory. The kind of victory that can't be measured in territories conquered or enemies defeated, but in cultures preserved and ways of life maintained against impossible odds. The Sami didn't just resist the Vikings. They outlasted them, and in outlasting them, they achieved something more complete than any battlefield triumph could ever be. The Sami were not conquered, they endured. And in enduring, they left us a message that echoes across centuries. There are different ways to be strong, different ways to win, and different ways to write history. The only question is whether we're brave enough to listen to stories that challenge everything we thought we knew.